By the winter of 1944, Europe was an equation written in fire. Over 60 million lives had already been lost. Entire cities vanished beneath smoke and rubble. And yet, amid that chaos, a new sound began to echo across the battlefields, not the roar of engines or the scream of artillery, but something sharper, cleaner, faster than any soldier had ever heard. They called it the impossible shot. It began somewhere near Metz, France, when a German Panther tank, fortress of steel and pride of the Wehrmacht, met an American Sherman across a frozen field. One trigger pull and physics, for the first time in the war, failed to explain what followed. No explosion, no thunder, just a flash, a line of light. Seconds later, the Panther stopped moving. That night, soldiers whispered through radio static, "It wasn't a shell." And they were right. It wasn't. For years, German armor had ruled the battlefield. The Panther and Tiger monsters of 45 tons, with 80 millimeters of angled armor that no Allied gun could pierce. Reports from Normandy were grim. For every German tank destroyed, 5 Shermans were lost. Some units didn't even return. Allied engineers called it the armor gap. Crews called it something darker, suicide on treads. But behind the silence of research labs in Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, American scientists were rewriting the rules. They weren't building bigger guns. They were changing the very idea of what a bullet could be. A new word entered the vocabulary of war: tungsten, harder than steel, denser than lead, a metal so rare that even the U.S. government rationed it like gold. But when shaped into a needle and fired at 3,400 feet per second, tungsten did something. Armor could not predict it, ignored it. In October 1944, the first crates marked M93 HVAP experimental were shipped to the front. Only veteran crews received them, with one order written in red ink: fire sparingly. Each round cost more than a soldier's monthly pay, but its value couldn't be measured in money, it was measured in survival. When that first HVAP struck the Panther, witnesses described it like a ghost entering metal, no sound, no warning, just stillness after impact. To the Germans, it was unholy. To the Americans, it was hope cast in tungsten. As dawn rose over ruined Europe, the equation had changed. Steel met science, and steel lost. What exactly was this new weapon? How could one projectile erase years of armor supremacy overnight? And who were the men who dared test physics on the battlefield? The answers lay not in strategy, but in science, in the minds of quiet engineers who turned math into fire and saved an army from extinction. Their creation would redefine not only the war, but the future of warfare itself. Across Europe, entire armored battalions were burning out faster than they could be replaced. American reports from Normandy were brutal in their honesty. For every German tank destroyed, 5 Shermans were lost. The odds weren't courage, they were mathematics. The Germans had mastered that math. Their engineers carved perfection into steel. The Tiger 157 tons of unstoppable weight could shrug off nearly every Allied shell. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. Its main gun could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Panther, lighter but faster, outturned, outshot, and outlived anything in its path. To face one head-on was to gamble with physics itself. Back home, generals faced a darker calculation. The United States was building tanks faster than anyone, nearly 50,000 Shermans by 1944, yet each one carried a gun that history was already outpacing. Quantity has a quality of its own, they said. But even mass production couldn't fill the hole that was opening in every battlefield report. Our shells don't bite. So the question wasn't how to make more tanks. It was how to make one shell that changed everything. The answer came not from generals, but from scientists. Inside the quiet halls of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, physicists and metallurgists worked in secrecy under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the same body that birthed radar, proximity fuses, and the Manhattan Project. Their mission: rewrite the equation of penetration. They began with a material that didn't obey normal limits, tungsten carbide, the hardest substance ever mass-produced at the time. Twice the density of steel, a melting point of 3,422 degrees Celsius, 6,192 degrees Fahrenheit. One scientist described it as matter that refuses to surrender. The logic was simple. The execution was impossible. A standard shell relied on mass and speed-heavy slug, big impact. But tungsten didn't need mass. It needed velocity. If they could fire a tungsten core small enough, light enough, and fast enough, it could slice through armor before the metal even knew it was hit. They called it HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. It wasn't just ammunition. It was engineering turned into vengeance. By September 1944, prototypes were tested at over 3,400 feet per second, faster than the muzzle velocity of any Allied tank gun in existence. At that speed, steel didn't crack, it flowed. Under the microscope, impact tests showed armor plates rippling like liquid before solidifying again. One Aberdeen engineer wrote in disbelief, "It behaves less like impact and more like evaporation." But tungsten was scarce. The US held limited reserves, most of it imported from Portugal, China, and Bolivia. Every pound diverted to HVAP meant less for machine tools, drill bits, and aircraft engines. The government debated. Generals argued. Finally, a compromise. Issue it only to the best tank crews with proven kill records. The message was clear: don't waste it. In October 1944, the first shipment left Maryland under armed guard. Crates labeled M93 HVAP, experimental use only, were sent to the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions in France. Each round cost nearly 10 times that of a standard shell, but its potential unmeasurable. What the crews didn't know yet was that the shell they were loading carried more than metal. It carried a change in belief. For the first time, science had handed ordinary soldiers something extraordinary, a weapon that wasn't born from brute strength, but from intellect, calculation, and precision. In the coming weeks, that weapon would draw its first bloodless proof not in laboratories, but on the frozen plains of Metz, where 3 Panthers waited behind the fog, confident in their invincibility. And when the trigger was pulled, the world would learn that war had entered a new chapter, not the age of armor, but the age of velocity. Oktober 29, 1944, near Metz, France. The morning rose cold, metallic, wrapped in fog. Fields scarred by weeks of shelling looked like open graves for machines. Across that ruined valley waited 3 Panther tanks of the Wehrmacht, confident, patient, fed by belief in their invincible armor. For months, German steel had written its own rules. At ranges beyond 1,500 yards, Allied shells simply bounced. Every battle report repeated the same equation. Panther strikes first, Sherman burns second. The average life expectancy of a Sherman crew in combat? Just 6 minutes. But this morning, something was different. In the lead Sherman, Sergeant Michael Hartley, a gunner with 47 engagements behind him, loaded a new round he didn't yet trust, M93 HVAP. It gleamed silver under the dim light, lighter than the usual shell, wrapped in its aluminum sabot like a secret waiting to be told. The order came. Target Panther, 800 yards, hull down. Hartley exhaled. The 76mm gun cracked sharper, cleaner, almost elegant. Observers later said the recoil looked wrong, the sound too high. Then silence. Through the scope, the Panther froze mid-turn. No explosion, no plume. Just a thin thread of smoke curling upward, black against grey. Seconds passed. Then a door swung open. The German crew never fired back. When US engineers reached the wreck days later, they found something the textbooks didn't cover: a hole, perfectly circular, clean as if drilled by a god's compass. Edges fused into glass, paint blistered smooth. Inside, the air still shimmered with heat. The report was clinical but stunned. Penetration complete. Armor yield exceeded. Target destroyed by thermal pressure, not detonation. That one line became legend. Within weeks, news of the hot shot, the soldiers' nickname for the HVAP, spread across Allied divisions. Crews treated each round like treasure, chalking crosses on their turrets after every confirmed kill. At command briefings, officers whispered that the odds were shifting. For the first time since Normandy, the numbers began to favor the men inside the Shermans. By November 1944, frontline data proved it. American armor losses dropped by 27% wherever HVAP rounds were issued. German Panther recovery teams logged dozens of tanks disabled by single shots, something no one believed possible 6 months earlier. One German technical officer wrote in frustration, "We no longer understand the geometry of defeat, but victory carried unease." The crews knew what they were wielding wasn't ordinary. They saw enemy tanks stop without visible damage, smoke curling quietly from inside. Some called it science, others called it sorcery. Back in Maryland, scientists studied field reports with disbelief and pride. Their calculations were working better than expected. At 3,400 feet per second, the tungsten core didn't just pierce steel, it transformed it. The kinetic force converted to heat, generating temperatures over 1,200 degrees Celsius in milliseconds. Armor became liquid for an instant, then froze again, a metallic scar testifying to the moment physics surrendered. But on the battlefield, theory meant nothing. Every pull of the trigger still meant risk, smoke, and luck. Hartley's platoon would later face 6 more engagements before winter. He survived only because of the handful of silver rounds he'd hoarded like talismans. The tide was turning, but not fast enough. Across the continent, the Wehrmacht was preparing its last gamble, a counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest. There, under the cover of snow and cloud, over 200,000 German troops and 500 tanks gathered for a strike meant to cut the Allied line in two. The American front was thin, exhausted, undersupplied. Tank crews cleaned their guns in silence, knowing winter was coming, and with it, the final test of the weapon that had just rewritten the rules of war. They didn't yet know its true name. Not HVAP. Not M93. History would remember it as something else. The moment intelligence outran armor, and revenge was measured in velocity. Chungborn, December 16th, 1944 dawn crept over the Ardennes forest like a grey tide, swallowing Europe. Snow drifted in sheets, muffling engines, blurring lines. The world felt frozen, quiet, too quiet for what was coming. Then the silence broke. From the tree line, panzer divisions rolled out steel phantoms in white camouflage, grinding ice under their treads. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by 500 tanks and assault guns, crashed into the thin American front. It was Hitler's final gamble, Operation Rhine, known later as the Battle of the Bulge. The goal: split the Allied line, seize Antwerp, and force the West to negotiate before the East devoured Berlin. Within 48 hours, chaos reigned. Entire US units vanished in the snow. Over 80,000 American casualties were reported in the first weeks, the largest loss of the war for the United States. Fuel convoys burned. Radios went silent. Commanders thought the line had collapsed. But deep inside that storm, among the encircled, a handful of tank crews carried something new, a handful of M93 HVAP rounds, last of the stockpiles from Maryland. Each one small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, powerful enough to rewrite a battlefield. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, 17 Shermans and their crews prepared for the impossible. Their supply trucks had been cut off. They faced nearly 300 German tanks advancing through the fog. It wasn't a battle, it was arithmetic. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, commanding the relief column, issued an order that felt more like prayer than tactics. No suppression fire, no warning shots. Every round is a kill shot. You fire only when you see the cross. The first engagement came at 90 yards, point blank in the frozen dawn. A Panther emerged from the trees, its gun slewing left. The Sherman fired once. The tungsten core punched through the glacis plate, 80 millimeters of sloped armor, the one place no American gun had ever broken. The Panther rolled forward 10 feet and stopped, then another and another. 11 HVAP rounds fired, 7 enemy tanks destroyed. Witnesses described the aftermath as unreal. No firestorm, no explosions, just machines gone silent in the snow, steam rising from their hatches like the last breath of winter. For the Germans, disbelief turned to dread. Their reports, intercepted by Allied intelligence, read like panic. Enemy possesses unknown armor, defeating weapon, conventional tactics ineffective, request immediate reassessment. But there was no reassessment. Orders were orders. The panzers pushed on, and physics didn't care. Every kilometer forward cost them another machine, another crew. By Christmas, the German offensive had lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, nearly half its striking power, much of it to the very weapon they couldn't understand. Veteran commanders who had survived Kursk now faced something different: invisibility. They couldn't see what killed them, couldn't defend against it. One officer wrote in his field diary, "Armor no longer means protection, it means a trap." And fear, real, bone-deep fear, began to take hold. Crews started welding scrap plates onto their tanks, hoping to break whatever sorcery the Americans were using. It didn't work. The HVAP tore through every layer like paper. A few German tankers simply refused to advance without infantry cover. Others abandoned their vehicles entirely, choosing the forest over the front. The war that had once been ruled by steel and courage was now ruled by doubt. Behind the lines, German intelligence called emergency meetings. Engineers analyzed damaged hulls, searching for evidence. Some whispered about incendiary compounds, others secret Allied radiation weapons. None guessed the truth, that they were being undone by density, temperature, and speed. The psychological collapse spread faster than the mechanical one. German reports documented crews showing combat exhaustion without combat, men trembling at the sight of American barrels, certain death would come without warning. By January 1945, snow still blanketed the Ardennes, but the offensive was dead. The Wehrmacht had lost over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and most of its faith. The Americans, bloodied but unbroken, had proven that precision could conquer power. In the aftermath, as wrecks froze in the valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg, Allied engineers moved among them, cataloguing what remained: scorched metal, twisted steel, and something invisible yet permanent. The moment when the human mind, armed with science, overtook the machine. But the war wasn't done. Ahead lay the Rhine, and waiting behind it, the King Tiger, the heaviest tank ever built, wearing armor no shell on earth was supposed to pierce. And yet, the next chapter would prove inevitability travels faster than belief. The Rhine shimmered beneath a low German sun, wide, grey, cold as the war itself. On its eastern bank, the last stronghold of the Reich stood waiting. Behind the rubble and desperation, a new monster idled, the King Tiger. 90 tons of German perfection. Frontal armor 180 millimeters thick, sloped to deflect everything the Allies could throw. Its 88 millimeters cannon could punch through a Sherman from over 2 miles away. It was not a tank, it was a fortress dragging its own shadow. The German commanders believed it untouchable. They were wrong. Across the river, the Americans were no longer the desperate army of 1,944. They had learned, they had adapted, and now they carried the culmination of that learning: the T-30E-16 HVAP, a 90 millimeters tungsten core fired at over 3,500 feet per second. It wasn't the size of the shell that mattered anymore. It was the speed of belief science turned into inevitability. By March 7th, at the town of Remagen, U.S. forces found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. It was a miracle of chance and momentum. The Germans had rigged it to explode. The charges failed. Within hours, 8,000 Allied troops had crossed. Days later, 20,000 more. The final act of the European war was set. German commanders threw everything they had left into the river's defense: King Tigers, Panthers, anti-tank guns, and the remnants of once elite Panzer battalions. But their fuel was gone, their morale thinner than their ammunition. The cold arithmetic of war had turned against them. The first clash came on March 10th, near the village of Erpel. 3 King Tigers held a ridge, their barrels sweeping the valley below. From the west, American tank destroyers M93 Jacksons, each armed with the 90mm gun, rolled into position. The order was simple: hold the crossing at any cost. At 1,200 yards, the lead M36 fired the first T-30E16 HVAP round in combat. The tungsten core crossed that distance in less than half a second. The King Tiger's frontal plate, 180mm of steel, forged by the best minds in Germany, cracked, then yielded, then opened. Observers saw no explosion, just a slow bloom of smoke from the hatches. Inside, the temperature spiked beyond measure. The impossible had happened. The fortress had fallen to physics. From that moment on, the myth of German armor superiority began to dissolve. In 2 weeks of fighting along the Rhine, Allied records logged over 200 heavy tanks destroyed, half of them by high-velocity tungsten rounds. It was the cleanest reversal in armored history. The hunter became the hunted. German crews, once confident, now hesitated. They moved slower, fired later. One intelligence report captured the shift in tone. Enemy tank crews show increasing signs of fatalism. Armor no longer equates to safety. Distance no longer equates to time. It wasn't just material defeat, it was mental collapse. And yet, even in collapse, there was tragedy. Those German tankers were still soldiers, many barely 20 years old, following orders written by ghosts. They weren't fighting for victory anymore, only for delay. They watched their machines, the pride of German engineering, turned into monuments of melting steel. The sound of tungsten-piercing armor became the sound of the war ending. In early April, Allied engineers examined the wrecks left behind on the western bank. The results stunned even the scientists who designed the HVAP. Each penetration left edges smooth as glass, surrounded by heat-affected zones where steel had liquefied and re-solidified in milliseconds. Temperatures had reached 1,200 to 1,400 degrees Celsius at the point of impact. Forensic teams found that pressure inside tank compartments rose faster than human lungs could respond. Not an explosion, but a vacuum reversed. The HVAP had proven more than a weapon. It was a revelation. The future of warfare would belong not to armor, but to velocity. By May 1945, Germany's once feared panzer divisions were ghosts. Of the 6,000 armored vehicles deployed to the Western Front in the last 6 months, fewer than 400 remained operational. When the Reich finally surrendered on May 8th, its war machine had been undone, not by numbers, nor by luck, but by the quiet precision of science. Still, victory brought no celebration among the men who pulled the triggers. Many Sherman crews later admitted they felt no triumph watching enemy tanks die so suddenly. They had seen the same fear reflected back at them, a shared understanding that war had crossed a line it could never return from. One U.S. tanker wrote in his diary, "We used to fear the Tiger, now they fear us. But in that fear, I see myself." The HVAP had done more than pierce armor, it had pierced conscience. After the war, as the world rebuilt, scientists examined the tungsten shells again, not to celebrate, but to learn. Their principles would seed the weapons of the next century. APDS, APFSDS, depleted uranium, all descendants of that first tungsten core fired in 1944. Every tank round today, every missile designed to defeat armor, carries a whisper of that same equation: density, velocity, inevitability. But perhaps the truest legacy of the HVAP lies beyond metallurgy. It reminded the world that the most powerful weapon in war is not hatred, it's intellect. That victory belongs not to those who build the heaviest armor, but to those who understand the invisible laws that govern the visible world. When the veterans of the Ardennes and the Rhine grew old, they spoke less about the fear and more about the wonder the moment they realized that human ingenuity could reshape fate itself. In the end, It wasn't witchcraft that defeated German steel. It was tungsten, traveling at the speed of inevitability, and behind it, the relentless will of human minds, refusing to surrender to the impossible.